Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mixtape Podcast. Today, I have very two special guests with me, and today we are going to be talking about something that we haven't really covered hardcore. So, our today's subject is going to be very much focused on art and a very different and unique aspect of art. I have with me Nicholas and Bharti, who are co-curators of a very interesting exhibition by the name of Bagh-e Hind. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So let's just dig in and Bagh-e Hind, and I think for the majority of my audience, which is from the subcontinent area at the moment, they might get some reference of what the term means. And so I'll just open it up to you guys to just share what it is. But before we dig into the exhibit specifically, I would like each of you to share a bit of your background of what you guys do, the sort of art you guys, I don't know if practice is the right term for it, but yeah, just share a bit about yourself.
So I'll go first. So I began my career thinking that I would be an artist. And I was very young at the time and realized actually I don't have a point of view to express, so I would make a very terrible artist. And so I became an art critic, and it was not something that I intended to be. But yeah, between 2009 and around 2017, 2018, I wrote widely about Southeast Asian contemporary art, a little bit of I covered the practices of artists in the Middle East, in even like the diaspora South Asian art, which I find very interesting and politically charged, which is totally my wheelhouse. And then around 2018, I began experimenting in the field of fragrance and flavor. And at the same time, I was also looking at these very beautiful collections of South Asian art in museums such as the Met, the Smithsonian, the British Museum, and not with any particular intention as such, just to sort of look at these works and just enjoy them visually and just take them in. So at that time, this idea, right, these two confluences of fragrance, flavor, and art just came together. And so that is the origin of our exhibition, Bagh-e Hind.
Mm-hmm. Nicholas?
I am trained as a scholar. I have a PhD in South Asian Studies. I work primarily, so I do primarily historical work using Persian and various registers of Hindi and Urdu and Sanskrit. And my particular sort of research area for most of my graduate school career and the subject of my PhD were gardens and garden writing. So historically, there's sort of this, there's these categories of the Mughal garden and the Islamic garden, which have to some degree been the subject of study, although not nearly enough, in my opinion. But usually from a sort of architectural history perspective. I mean, it's usually sort of the built remnants that we still have, and those have been the subject of study. Sometimes, the work of some of the better art historians, certainly drawing on contemporary, imperial texts to sort of make sense of them, but very much focused on the sort of built environment. Whereas my interest has been sort of more on the more ephemeral things that actually animate gardens that happen in between that, the actual, botany and practices of cultivation that go into actually making these spaces, living spaces, the part that unfortunately very often is either missing now or has dramatically changed. And also the role that that these practices and these materials had in the intellectual and artistic culture of the time. So that that brought me eventually sort of from text to image, because the sort of counterpart to reading descriptions of gardens and reading historic farming manuals and so on was looking at the actual pictorial record of seeing what people chose to represent about gardens in early modern South Asian painting. the 17th, 18th, 16th, even but 17th, 18th, particularly centuries, where, gardens really are one of the central concerns of what artists depicted, similar to what I argue their sort of central role in the general cultural imagination and intellectual life of at least the elites of the period. They sort of occupied.
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting because, what you were mentioning about botany, somehow mixing with your subject of interest. It's very interesting because usually people sort of stereotype that, the scientific side of things and arts don't really, interconnect. If you're into science, you're only into science, but if you're into art, you're totally into art. But I always find this fascinating, as I got to talk to some of other art people as well who are sort of gelling the two fields together. So I think that's very amazing, and the right thing, kind of thing to explore anything. You can't just do it in a binary fashion. And speaking of gardens, and speaking of the era that Bharti sort of touched upon, I live in the city of Lahore, which is also known as City of Gardens, and the main gardens from the Mughal era, we still have them, not obviously in that pristine condition, I am assuming, but obviously, the Shalimar Gardens and all that, we still have it, and we still associate with that sort of concept of leisure. What you guys did with this exhibit was not, because usually when we talk about art or paintings or specifically historical art, it's mostly connected with, what sort of paintings you get to see, miniature art, or sort of, this, it's more visual. But you guys went into doing something that was touching upon other senses, other five senses, that you can smell, you can touch. So how did that idea came about, and how did you guys ended up collaborating on that?
I'll take this one. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how this happened, why, because now hindsight is 2020. So, I have a lot of time to introspect. When I was researching fragrance and flavor, a lot of these materials actually overlap between the two fields. So it's the same kind of extract that is used, or even aroma chemical, synthetic aroma chemical that is used for food flavoring and perfumery. So I looked at all of these paintings on the other hand and realized that I cannot identify the plants, the flowers, the lush garden atmosphere, So I wanted to translate these paintings, or actually, yeah, I think translation is a really good word here, because it leaves a little bit of room to go a little, a little less, a little more. It allowed me to experience the atmosphere embedded in these paintings. And I thought that is what perfume and flavor could do. You could eat the painting, listen to it, or bathe with it. And I thought maybe that kind of those sort of modes of reimagining how we could experience and learn about history was something that hasn't been attempted before. Yeah. And I came across Nicolas's work in the summer of 2020. And I thought it was fascinating that somebody, not only reads these horticultural texts, but also identifies the plants and then grows them. So in a sense, I thought his practice was quite parallel to mine. So while he has all of this gardening knowledge, and plant knowledge, actually, I have the understanding of what these things smell like, but in extract form, in synthetic form. So I had this idea for Bagh-e Hind in 2018 when I began my research almost instinctively. And I just had to find the right type of historian who would take these very fantastical ideas and anchor them to the context of 17th and 18th century. So it's a very specific period. I didn't want to just go about, searching for any random folio and just presenting any kind of perfume translation. I did not think that would work. I did not think that that would be meaningful, and I wanted to do something bigger, holistic. So I interviewed him in about 2020. And a year later, I asked him if he wants to actually collaborate on this very small idea that I have.
Which has just grown from there.
Hook him and then reel him in. That's how, you know, the partnership began in June of last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing, to me, it wasn't actually, you know, it's an absolutely wonderful idea, but to me, it wasn't actually sort of outlandish in a way that I think underpins the surprise of a lot of people we now present it to, because it in a sense, it seems to me quite logical to interpret the paintings in this manner, because and this is, you know, sort of part of what I really feel passionate about the project, is that this pleasure in material culture, again, this focus on the gardens, on the activities in the gardens, on the way people socially and intellectually related to them, and on the other material objects that went into those practices, like, you know, incense burners, food, perfume. I mean, sometimes there is perfume in addition to the fragrant flowers. There's also depictions of perfume in the painting, right? All of that, to my mind, is so obviously part of what the painting is intended to do, what was intentionally included to it, and what would have been legible to these contemporary audiences, again, which is why, you know, as Bharti said, there's a point to tying it to that particular historical period, where we have this particular set of sort of evidence and knowledge. Fair, it's also the period I work on, so it's why I could be useful. But in a sense, it's quite logical to explore the paintings through that lens, because I think to their creators and to their contemporary audience, that was part of how they worked. It was just that at least the elite kind of actors who they were primarily circulating at had those references already. They knew those plants, they knew their literary associations. They used those like materials of consumption, you know, from the perfume to the pan to the incense, etc. That, like, this was part of their material world, and this all had particular associations of, you know, of pleasure and leisure and wealth, power, and so on. And it was part of what made the painting legible. And in a way, the way we now academically tend to frame these paintings and saying, we don't actually pay enough attention to that, to the materiality. We're sort of tend to be very sort of caught up with, you know, networks of artists or artistic style, or the questions of power, which sort of dominate academic. That's kind of like, what did this do for imperial ideology or courtly, you know, or smaller courts vis-a-vis the larger Mughal polity, and so on, which are all, you know, very valid questions. But what sort of gets lost in there is the actual celebration of pleasure and material experience, that I think was a very big part of why these things were actually powerful.
True. And I think anybody, I think, varying degrees of, obviously, then they're the academics or the experts, and then the general public who just at times gets to see or enjoys these paintings. I think also are a couple of my friends, and we also at times, when we discuss that era of our history, it's always like, you know, or when you go and visit these historical sites in Lahore, which is inside the walled city, we always say, you know, like the Shahi Hammam and everything, like they spend so much time and energy and concentration into, you know, yes, we are working, we are doing, but, you know, this is what we are going to do for leisure, and this is what we're going to do for relaxing. You know, things that we now think that we are the ones who, you know, are doing the, you know, work, and then we need our me times and everything. They had it covered, and in a more artistic and more grand way that I think we can ever reach. So moving on, I would obviously, because Bharti also mentioned, you know, that she picked those, didn't just want to like go in and cover, because it's a huge period. There's whole you know, varying stages and varying eras of, you know, the kings, and obviously every king's power basically reflected in their architecture and everything that they did. So you picked very specific areas. So I would like to, maybe you guys can elaborate on a bit more in depth as to why you picked those specific eras, what attracted you specifically, any personal favorites or whatever. But before you do that, I would also like that you guys, for our audience sake, because I have had a personalized curated tour with Bharti, so maybe for the audience to just give them an overview of what the exhibit is, where they can go and access it, and if somebody wants to have those products that you make along with it for the the entire experience, how can they get those as well?
Okay, so well, the exhibit, the virtual part, the very visual part of the exhibit can be found online at www.bagh-e-hind.com. And it's structured, the main part of the exhibit is structured in 5 sections around the 5 core paintings, corresponding also to 5 prime scent notes, which are rose, iris, rose, narcissus, smoke, iris, and Kara. And the core, and those are, that's a salient element of each painting, but that's sort of the core painting. Then from there, each painting is actually paired with a much larger cluster of paintings that contextualize it art historically in terms of a genre style, which is something that was sort of very important to me, to show how artistic creativity sort of worked in a different but no less valuable way in pre-colonial South Asia, where paintings weren't necessarily unique in composition or in content. Like each of these paintings actually represents a larger sort of genus of or genre of paintings that share similar composition and or similar thematic content, but often with very interesting variations. So, for example, in the smoke section, we have a late Mughal as our core painting. We have a late Mughal scene of a noble and a group of women on a terrace watching fireworks and lighting sparklers. And there's incense and smoke and sort of smoke wafting and so on. So it's, strong smoke olfactory elements. And then within the larger cluster, there are multiple paintings that have essentially the same composition, including one that is literally the same composition. It's clearly based on the same basic design, but the detailed style, but it's from the Rajput court of Kishangarh in Rajasthan. And the style of the figures is sort of slightly changed to reflect the specific style of the Kishangarh atelier. But more importantly, while the women are pretty more or less the same, the figure of the noble with them has been replaced with Radha and Krishna. So it's been in turn from a sort of somewhat historical portrait scene to a Hindu devotional context, even though the composition is the same, right? So we try to sort of highlight those kind of things. Then there's a gallery of actual photographs of the plants featured in the artwork and in the perfume, to reflect, to give people that connection to the actual material reality, to show, that encoding of botanical information in the painting. There is another gallery in each section of material objects from museum collections around the world, to show again the material culture encoded in the paintings, and to connect the project to a sort of larger material culture, and to highlight what there is to be found in museum and private collections that we don't normally get to see either, similar to the paintings. And then finally, there is a gallery illustrating Bharti's process of actually creating the olfactory sort of responses, the translations, And our notes are the transcripts of our notes from developing the project, to really sort of make the process available and transparent, and let people sort of see how we got there. So that's the gallery itself. Then we have a curatorial catalog, which we continue to add to, which right now has a wonderful essay by Bharti. Soon it's going to get another one by me. And it has reading lists, both on gardens and the history of fragrance in South Asia, and on contemporary perfume and flavor practice, with a lot of really interesting blogs and podcasts that Bharti has curated. And then we have an exit through the gift shop, which leads you to, being able to actually buy the products that reflect the project, if you're so inclined.
In fact, the gift shop is really a cheeky reference to a documentary by Banksy, and I still don't understand whether that was spoof or that was actually made in sincerity. I just like that so much, and if we're going to be bold enough to just do a project like this and call it a museum show, and it's our museum, we can have a gift shop, and it'll be better than any gift shop that I have actually seen on my various trips all over the world, because they end up having keychains and pens and t-shirts, and it's so disappointing that it's as if the people who run these gift shops do not look at what is in the museum, and there's such a disconnect. So there are synesthesia boxes that include the perfume and other synesthesia elements, like tea and incense, and also hand blown glass that has been crafted just for the show. And people in India, I think I can ship to Pakistan too. I think I can. It just has to go via Dubai.
That's a different conversation. We'll get into that. We'll get into that.
What people can do in the meantime is just book a tour with me through the shop. And I'm just loving these responses that people are giving, that they're like, oh, just before the tour, I'm going to light an incense, or I'm going to wear perfume, or like people doing small things, small leisurely pleasurable things, that they are creating an atmosphere for themselves in order to enjoy the show, whether with me or just on their own. And I'm really touched by that.
So getting a bit into, I know we can call it, for lack of a better term, the technicalities of the show. Like, I want to sort of dig deep into both your expertise. So maybe Nicolas, if you can share, how you ended up identifying the flowers. What obviously we see these pictures, and as you already guys shared, that in those eras, gardens and flowers, they were plenty, and their depiction was there, a lot of it. So how did you choose specific plants? Because when I went through the site and the tour, the curated tour, there were very specific flowers that where you guys get into detail and highlight their significance. So share a bit about that, and then Bharti, maybe you can add into what you did for this, all these perfumes, the soaps and textures that you created. How was, just share the the creation process behind that.
So my selection process for it was sort of a dynamic back and forth of criteria, when Bharti sort of asked me to select the paintings, that was already sort of driven by the idea of, okay, what floral elements or olfactory elements would be particularly valuable to highlight. So I started with the rose, and I wanted paintings that really center those, so that it's very clear that this was part of the intent, that the flower or plant, or in one case smoke element, was something that the artist intended to be taken away from the painting, and for these to be elements that were that represented sort of a gamut of things. So I started with a painting that really prominently features roses. literally a king in a rose garden, but it's really a plantation of roses. It's a field of roses that at that scale will almost certainly grown to be used to make rose water and, cosmetics and food. So because rose, is a flower that we're still reasonably familiar with generally, especially in South Asia. It's it's an olfactant that we're reasonably familiar with. I mean, right? We still use rose water a fair bit. We have a lot of rose flavored products, not so much in the West, but in South Asia. So the point, it was sort of an easier point of entry, right? The rose element is very clear there, but rose is also an understandable botanical / olfactant to to most audiences. The next one I picked was Narcissus, Nargis, which is a little bit more niche because it's rarer nowadays. It has more complicated literary associations in Persian Urdu literature that people tend to not be as familiar with anymore as they, as roses, which sort of globally have this idea of like a, luxury and romance. And it has a very distinctive smell, and that smell is divisive. It's historically celebrated in South Asia as being, sweet and refreshing, and it's a muftarih, an exhilarant. It opens the breathing and the brain and strengthens the heart. Whereas in a lot of Western cultures, people aren't very familiar with it because this type of narcissus, that's the typical kind that you get in the hills in India and Pakistan, is less common. But even where it does exist, people in the US and a lot of Western Europe, people actually don't like the smell. It's considered a fairly, it's too much of an animalic smell. So it's often associated with animal urine. Like in the US, people will say it smells like cat urine. In the name for those kind of narcissi in Spain and Portugal, for example, actually translates to like fox piss or donkey piss. Because people associate it, so it's a very culturally very conditioned association smell. I personally really like the smell. For me, it is a sweet spring smell, and this idea of it being, even though I might not necessarily subscribe to Unani medicine, this sort of historic idea of it being a sort of strengthening, invigorating smell, I can very much see where that sort of comes from. It's sometimes positioned almost as an antidepressive in early modern texts. So I wanted to a painting, that highlights the narcissus and then a series of the narcissus, and so that's the core flower that we highlighted there. Then we had smoke, which was actually Bharti's idea. It's our only sort of non-botanical, core element, but I think it works really, really beautiful, and it is I mean, we have one section where it's the primary note, but it actually sort of came about because it showed up as a minor element already in the rose painting, because there's ash and sort of campfires in that painting. And then we have iris, which that one is a sort of an interesting one. It's more complicated because it arises sort of from the fact that irises are incredibly common flowers in Mughal art. They were incredibly popular as a motif, and I picked this garden painting, and irises sort of feature prominently in that painting. But with irises, there's sort of a disjunction between them as a perfumery ingredient, because the perfumery smell is actually made from the roots. The perfume ingredient that's made from iris is made from the roots, and it has much more of a violet smell, whereas the flower smells of grapes. Has this grapey smell. So, and in South Asia, and a lot of in the cooler parts of the subcontinent, you would actually get irises as garden flowers, especially in the Mughal period very much, but and still nowadays, but in a lot of the subcontinent, the flower was a popular motif of the visual arts, but the product people would have actually had access to would have been the dried root as a perfumery ingredient and medical ingredient. So there's sort of an interesting complexity there. And then the final one is Kera, which, and that one in sort of the gradient from the rose being the most accessible to the Kera being the least accessible, that was sort of a nice gradient there, because Kera, again, is similar in a sense to the rose and the narcissus in that it is a very common cultural reference in early modern South Asia, and it's very much associated in Mughal and more regional local texts with luxury, and it's seen as very specifically Indian by, especially when you have sort of people writing in Persian who might be writing for a more Iranian audience and whatnot. They very much single this out as something that's a distinctive perk of being in India. And it's very commonly included in depictions of gardens and landscapes, and yet it's not a plant people are by and large very familiar with today. The plant's kind of bizarre looking and big, and so not necessarily something people put in their manicured front gardens, right? Although the one I ever found in Delhi was in a very posh front yard. And at the same time, and similarly, the smell has sort of disappeared somewhat from perfumery. It's now sort of been relegated to being a cooking ingredient and tobacco flavoring, right? So it sort of had a loss of status from like a very, very luxurious perfumery ingredient, and a flower that you would actually buy the fresh flower just to enjoy the perfume, and offer it to your guests, to something, that's some synthetic extract that you use in biryani. So again, that's sort of that historical change, and was something that became part of what made it interesting. After sort of wanting to include it because it has such historical relevance, then as we developed the product, we sort of saw that, there's this historical shift in its perception and in its place.
And I did everything I could to just exclude Kevra, because I don't know, I found the smell of Kevra so repulsive, and so cloying and sweet and strong, and it took a lot for me to be persistent and try to figure out exactly what was the cause of the issue, because I haven't actually grown up in India, so I don't think I've actually consumed Kevra essence in food flavoring. I don't believe I have. I don't think that I don't think I've encountered pan and gutka as much either. So then there was this kind of sense of revulsion and an instinctive knowing that this is cheap material. This is really like sasta, really like pedestrian kind of a material. So I dug a little deeper and figured out actually, the scent that I was exposed to around 2018 during my research on materials was actually a synthetic material, and synthetic Kevra perfume is preferred because the natural extract is actually a skin irritant. So you apply it and you just get rashes, or I do anyway. So I could understand why there's a mass-produced synthetic version that people apparently use for anointing deities in their rituals. Again, this is not a ritual that I have come across. So again, I have no intimate sense of the Kevra, and yet I found it hideous. So, the actual Kevra extract, the skin irritant, is much more softer smelling. I can, like the first time I smelled it, like seriously smelled it, paid attention to it, stayed with it for a few days. I thought of it as milky, creamy, kind of like how mithai tastes. The taste of mithai was the smell. And so I actually stuck stuck with this particular element, it's, and of course it's always difficult to build. It's a lot easier to just like scrap everything and say, no, I am not going to face this like really atrocious material. And so I also found it interesting that, this is the value of having a historian's perspective, right? To know that this was actually a luxurious botanical musk, considered superior to animal musk. And in perfumery these days, there's a bit of a, cult, that people actually try to buy musk pods legally, illegally, from Russia, Siberia. It's kind of weird. People have this kind of fixation about
Kind of
pure
horrifying.
animal, and there is excellent synthetic materials available. So I've, in the process of putting together the paintings for the painting to perfume translations for painting number 1, 2, definitely, and 5, there is an extent of animalic scent. In the case of Kevra, painting number 5, there's also, this Ragini figure sitting by this pond. So there are elements of civet, castoreum, and also synthetic materials that actually mimic the scent of seaweed. The ozone, the air, slightly, salty but fresh, but melon-like nuances. So that's how we went about translating these paintings. And, I feel that people think about perfume as abstract and subjective, and to an extent it is. But actually both Nicholas and I, and as our working notes will illustrate, audiences can actually see that we went about it in a very logical sense. So if he's telling me that there is, there's rose, there's poppies, there's larkspur, there's tobacco, there's jasmine, then I actually go looking for tobacco, for jasmine. Poppies, of course, there was another synthetic that kind of brought in this element of narcotic powderiness, which the historian is very specific about describing to me. That is exactly what I needed, right? So, when he says poppies, and I'm like, well, poppies don't have any smell, not that I've encountered them, but I know that they don't have a scent. And then he gets very specific. So even in the case of Narcissus, he said, it has a spicy scent. Nargis has a spicy scent. And I said, well, which spice? Can you identify which specific spice? And he said, like saffron. So I thought, oh, okay, saffron extract. So it's an artistic process that also follows a certain logic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And
so,
it's sort of
go on.
And that part of it, I think, was sort of it was good that we sort of agreed on that, and both were invested in getting that right, because one of with much less of a with no real background or training in the perfumery side of things, but with this sort of very intimate familiarity with the actual living plants for most of these things. One of my absolute pet peeves are all of these sort of smell products that you get, that scented candles, incense, potpourris, room diffusers, etc., that have these like almost arbitrary random botanical names attached to them. It's like gardenia, plumeria, fig, and that smell nothing like the plant. They all just smell like generic soap. But people don't know.
Yeah.
Because most people haven't actually smelled the thing, and then they assume that smell is the thing. Like it's happens to me with friends and family, where eventually I make them face the actual plant. I shove the actual flower in their face, and they're like, oh, is this jasmine? I'm like, no, it's not jasmine, it's gardenia or whatever. And they're like, oh, but it doesn't smell like it. Like, that's because all the things you have been told that are not that.
You know what, this actually reminds me why I took up why I thought fragrance and flavor so appealing, and appealing as mediums of critique. It's because we're being shortchanged, even on the olfactive front, you know?
Yeah.
So I have smelled synthetic jasmine all along. But when I say synthetic jasmine, I mean, jasmine presented as hair oil.
Yeah.
Or presented as a body lotion. And then finding the actual extract, smelling it, finding ways to, even taste it. I couldn't believe how the distance between what is being sold to us, mass produced and sold, and the actual flower, the actual element, the actual extract is so much richer and layered and textured, and the notes are so complex. And I can kind of understand why these mass-produced synthetics cannot or don't bother to replicate those compounds exactly. And you know what the most difficult painting to translate was painting number 4, which is a garden scene. And we had some difficulty in translating that because, again, we're communicating with words. It's not cheap to ship him a few samples every now and then. So we had to be really careful or find inventive ways to communicate about the smells. Okay, so if iris, I have never come across an iris flower, so I don't even know. So now he's telling me it smells close to grapes. I didn't know that.
I think I mentioned that at some point, but it's also like it's again sort of culturally constructed, right? That if you ask someone in I should preface this. If you ask someone in North America that to smell an iris and ask them what it smells like, they will most likely tell you it smells like grape. If you took someone who spends all their time in South Asia or even in some parts of Europe and asked them to smell the iris, they probably wouldn't make the connection to grape, because it does smell like grape, but it doesn't smell like the grapes you mostly get in Europe and in India. It smells like a particular type of grape that you get a lot in North America. And more importantly, all the fake grape flavoring here is based on that variety of grape. So because of that, Americans have that, because Americans have, consumed grape flavored candy and etc. their whole lives. They have the association that particular flavor, which is really just the flavor of a particular type of grape, that is grape flavor. And they connect the iris smell to that. But someone who doesn't have that framing wouldn't identify that smell as grape. I don't know what they would sort of see it as.
So the most interesting part in this conversation that, to me as a layperson from this field is, how you guys have explained as to, smell or touch. One might assume that this is, these are not these are not like, they don't have context. Smell is smell, touch is touch. But the way he's explaining that how, flowers have variation, yes, slight variations, but they can't be this separate, but apparently they are. So yeah, this is very interesting. And so yeah, as you guys were mentioning, it is an artistic process, but what I feel is the way you guys have went about it, it has also a scientific or a methodological sort of context to it. So it's sort of also bringing those two aspects of it in line as well. So this is I don't know if it's a typical or an interesting question that you guys might have come across previously as well. It's something similar to what I think authors get asked, or a musician would get asked, what's your favorite from the work? So I would ask that, because you guys have like these various sections and specific paintings that you have divided this Bagh-e Hind exhibit into, which specific section is your favorite, each of you? And maybe if you guys want to share some I don't know, behind the scene fun aspect of, as you shared, you guys there are dialogues on the website between the two of you, but any specific thing for you when you were maybe identifying a flower and you realized that this is something that you came across for the first time, or for you, Bharti, when you were like making the the perfumes or any of the extracts, some interesting thing that you came across, that a light bulb moment during the preparation for this exhibit, if you guys want to share that.
Yeah, so with me living and working in India, my issue is often access to a lot of materials. So while I'm aware of what sort of materials are out there, I don't necessarily have access to them, in the sense that I just have to order them blind, right? So they arrive and then I figure it out. I smell each one. And when I usually receive materials, what I'm doing is that I'm keeping a few in different families aside, and I test them every day. I smell them every day, and I kind of like do this exercise where I'm familiarizing myself with each note, especially the synthetic aroma chemical notes that have chemical names that I can't even pronounce, so that by the time that I'm actually making the perfume, I can think, okay, fine, that butyl acetate, whatever that is, I know that is the note that will lend me this kind of slightly overripe fruit scent, like slightly fermented note. So one of this parcel that arrived was a really sweet gesture by a perfumer in the US who just sent me materials so that I could, just play around with them. And one of those materials was Narcissus, and it's an extract that is only made in France. You can't actually get it from anywhere. So it was a really, like, I understood how precious and rare that particular set of materials that he sent me was. They're very expensive, these raw materials. Like, this is really not something that one can do as a hobby. Really, it's too costly. So the Narcissus bottle, like an idiot, I just opened it and smelled it without realizing that you don't actually do these things with lotus extract, with Narcissus extract. And so I got a bit high for a few seconds. I couldn't quite function. And I think I don't even remember how the rest of that day went. So I checked with another perfumer who said, Bharti, we smell these in dilutions. We avoid smelling them altogether. but even that experience, right? Like, even that stupidity on my part, where I'm just like opening the bottle and just taking a very deep inhalation of this very potent material. It helped me understand painting number 2, right? Which is like, why are these men choosing the Narcissus at evening, in the evening time, at night? Why this particular flower? What are they're smelling it? But why not any other flower? Why the Narcissus in particular? And so I get it. But I let Nicolas say more about the significance of that particular flower in this kind of, coat culture.
So the Narcissus actually, from a painting and like complexity perspective, that actually is my favorite section as well. From in terms of like wearing the perfume perspective, the garden scene with the iris ended up being my favorite. But speaking of Narcissus, so I've sort of mentioned Narcissus has all these cultural associations that play into the way it appears in the artwork. The primary one of which is the sort of symbolic role that it plays in Persian and then Urdu poetry, which is that because the flower kind of looks like an eye, because it's a white, rim of outer petals and then a yellow cup in the middle. Poetic tradition likens it to an eye, and specifically a languid or jaundiced eye, which are all linked to sort of being lovesick, right? So because of that, poets tend to sort of endlessly play on the Narcissus and ideas of vision, sight, glances, but then also obviously the inverse, blindness, and so on. So there's always a connotation with seeing or not seeing. Glances with coquetry on when the Narcissus is involved, and then the second layer of sort of symbolism, which is a bit less ubiquitous, but also comes on often, is the fact that it's fragrant and it's cup shaped. So there's actually a lot of poetry also that that specifically links the Narcissus to fragrance, right? That it actually, it's like, oh, the Narcissus, because it has the stalk and then it has multiple flowers in that stalk that have this cup shape and are fragrant. The Narcissus is actually a servant girl standing in the garden, you know, holding a platter with perfume. So there's all of those sort of associations, and then there's this sort of you know, humoral medicine idea of the fragrance as an exhilarant, as an antidepressant, as something that will invigorate your sort of you physiologically and psychologically. And I think with this sort of core painting that we selected for that section, all of those elements I think are alluded to, because you have these two aristocratic young men sitting on a terrace in the evening. There's also a little bowl of jasmine flowers in front of them. So there's other smell references, but both of them are holding this very beautifully rendered, very realistically rendered sprig of narcissi and are sniffing them. And I think all of those layers of meaning are implicit there, right? Like they're obviously holding them and sniffing them because they are fragrant. And then the implication is that, you know, they're sort of expanding their mind and relaxing and becoming more aware, getting high, so to speak. Becoming more aware, obviously, though, is also linked to vision and to glances. And, you know, they're sort of like looking at each other with these sort of gentle smiles. So there's also this idea of the glance, right, and or of the male gaze in this case, direct between two males. That plays into that, and it's all, you know, and none of that is, you know, none of that is really readily apparent if you just look at the piece and you can't identify the flower, none of that is there. If you do see the flower and you're like, oh, that's a narcissus, that's a nargis, but you don't know that it has all of these, you know, would have had all these valences to an educated audience at the time, then again, you know, the actual meaning of the painting or the emotional impact of the painting is not there.
Nicholas, I have a question for you. Has anyone written on this particular painting before, or are we the first to present this painting with this kind of context?
Not that I've been able to find. I mean, it's in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts collection, and it's, you know, in their, as you know, it's on their website in their digitally accessible collections. So it has the basic information of like rough dating and provenance, but there's no they don't have any sort of analytical text on it, no description of what any of it means. And I have not, which doesn't mean that it couldn't be somewhere in a catalog or in some sort of thematic art historical study, but I have not come across it reproduced or discussed anywhere.
Yeah, so again, I'm like very interested in the aspects of, you know, the Mughal. I'm like rethinking of how, you know, the sort of art, whatever little art we are exposed to from that era, how do you know now perceive it? It's pretty interesting and pretty eye-opening, the work that you guys have done. So before I go in and ask you guys that what other things you guys are venturing into or doing, is there a timestamp? Because I think when we interacted for the first time, there was a timestamp to this exhibit, but then you said that you guys have planned to extend it and keep the digital format. So now, is it just going to be out there, or is there an extended timeline to it?
When I approached Nicholas with this idea to do an exhibition, I thought, you know what? It's an online exhibition, and like a physical exhibition, it could be on for a year and then we could take it all down. It's just that once I did all this work about, you know, building the site and putting it all together, well, one, it looked really beautiful. And two, I didn't want to take it down anymore. You know? So now it stays up as an archive, as a multisensory exhibition. That's also an archive that we will actually expand on. So I think I'll design a separate page within the exhibition itself. So audiences can learn about our projects as we kind of bring this exhibition out into the physical space.
Yeah, because I think it should stay there at least, in whatever form and whatever. Even if you run out of the physical things to send out, I think even the visuals are pretty interesting, and the conversations that you guys have put out there, it's pretty amazing. So moving on, before we wrap up, what else are you guys up to? What are your future plans? Any other projects that people need to look out individually, collectively, whatever?
Well, we are working, as Bharti mentioned, we're working on bringing this project into the physical world, hopefully in a series of smaller exhibitions of elements of it in various spaces, also and hopefully also as sort of a tie-in to other museum shows that use some of the same that reflect on some of the same artwork, that exhibit some of the same artwork. So we're hoping to sort of have tie-ins there to bring perhaps some of the sort of scent creations to those spaces, and to continue to sort of build further creative, interactive ways of letting people actually experience the materiality of it.
Well, my research into fragrance continues as it does, but I'm also working on soap as architecture, or the experience of architecture as soap. So there's a whole project that I'm developing with someone else, where we're looking at all of these stepwell forms. So, finding a way to present these, how did this question that actually began with Bagh-e Hind, and I now just go into different directions with it. We're really exploring how we can experience architecture and history and material culture in different forms that are very fun and playful and accessible to the public. So I'm also writing a piece about scholarship as soap, because I've been doing this, insane thing about translating. Well, I started by translating my own mind and practice and art experiences into soap. And I thought, yeah, this is exactly me, in color, in form. And this idea of having this form in your hand and the color running down your skin. So I've done a few translations. There's an essay on the color yellow that I translated for its author, and I was very tickled by the idea that she would have this really dense sulfuric yellow color that she wrote about, and it is now in the form of soap. And I made one for Nicholas as well, which he yet has to use. God knows whether he'll use it or not. He does not like to use my soaps because they're so beautiful that he will not use them.
I was just going to say, this is a problem that she repeatedly faces, not just with me, because she creates these soaps and they are so stunningly architectural that you really just want to put them on a pedestal and admire them. And it's but she really wants you to use them, and they are also beautifully fragrant. But it feels like such a desecration to partition them and actually start using them as soap. But the first one she sent me, I have used up. So
yeah,
there you go.
I got
you
over
have
myself.
Proof. You have proof on video that you used them.
Yeah, that really irritates me, because it was 2 months. Have you used the soap? Have you used the soap? He had not used it. And finally, I had to just bully him into using it. And I asked him for proof to show me a picture. And, honestly, I had to say that, what, I need your response for it for the website. So I had to trick him into using the soap.
She's also not a fairly inconsequent bully, though, because she then immediately proceeded to send me more soaps. So she was like, fine, I made you use it, but now I'm going to send you more, so you don't feel bad.
I feel like so these objects are made, and then the experience is the other side of that artwork, right? So you have to use them, smell them, imbibe them, right? Like how are we talking about, in what sense are we talking about eating a painting or drinking a garden, or inhaling the poetry? And so people have to actually experience the luxury that this kind of opulent world gives us a window into. I made a soap that translated Sylvia Hoodling's essay on Mughal textiles, embroidery, carpets, the mull on their the mull that they're wearing on their body, and the smell of it, how it's made, it smells, its origins and its use. And this, I was so fascinated with this idea of such fine luxury that we don't have access to anymore. Yeah. And what if I could just take this writing on it and translate it into scent and soap, right? So you actually inhale, imbibe this history of textiles, but through scent. So the scent has notes of civet, cashmere. So that the smell of pashmina that kind of has this kind of mothball or cedarwood note. Yeah. And really kind of captures that. And I want the author to experience their education, but in a different form, in a more enjoyable, playful form. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, this new, this translation of art is something that's unique, and I hope that it grows and sort of it helps, sort of maybe if I'm using the right term here, it's like democrat, making it more open for, the general public to this access to art, which has always been seen as, something that art is supposed to be just for the high end, a specific, people from socioeconomic category. But I think everywhere now it's being used as a form of expression, as a form of, and we are seeing so much innovation in art from all over the world that I think this is very interesting, and one of the, the positives that's coming out of this global village that we live in. Thank you so much for your time. This was such an interesting conversation. I hope to follow your work and hopefully have you back with whatever you guys end up doing. And hopefully you get more and more people get to see your exhibition and these translations.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you so much.
We invite the audience to take pleasure in our garden. So thank you so much for giving space and time.
See you next time. Bye.